Good evening and welcome. Thank you. So my name is Eric Simonis, and as you can hear, I am French. I am originally from Alsace, Alsace-Lorraine, from the city of Metz, near Luxembourg. And it's, I would say, an important city in the life of Lafayette because he was, the first time he heard about America really when he was in Metz, in Garnison. He was, I think, at the time 16 or 17 years of age. And there was in Metz, and there is still, this wonderful statue of him, and he's sitting on a horse. And being a child, I was always admiring this statue, not knowing who that was, only to later realize that that was our famous Marquis de Lafayette. So before I start, of course, I'd like to thank Kim for invitation. It's very nice of her to have me here. It is my very first time here in this lovely, lovely place and setting. So thank you again for the invitation. I owe some words of thanks also to Dr. Robert Selig. Many of you know him probably, and he's been very instrumental in providing me with some helpful document, let's put it this way, for this talk tonight. And another source of document that I found was from Professor Hugues Marquis, who is a professor in Poitiers at the Université de Poitiers, and who wrote a lot of books and documents about feeding the armies, not only in America, in France, of course, but has great knowledge of feeding the Royal French Army. So what I'm going to tell you today, I owe it mostly to Dr. Selig and to Professor Hugues Marquis. So very briefly, as we know, the War of Independence started in 1775, pitting the 13 American colonies against the United Kingdoms. In June of the same years, France secretly joined, shipping supplies to the Continental Army. The support of King Louis XVI to the American Revolutionary War was instrumental. He provided weapons, money, material, and of course, he sent French troops to the New World. It is true that France had to settle old accounts with England, most notably the 7 Years' War, which had been lost, unfortunately for the French, by Louis XV in 1763. So it was still a wound which was fairly fresh in the mind of the French. So in that sense, the American colonies provided a chance for revenge. Many historians argue that the involvement of King Louis XVI would later precipitate his fall. Indeed, in 1789, when the French Revolution took place, the Kingdom of France was on the brink of financial collapse. The money that the French king had poured into the American War of Independence certainly contributed to that fact. Lafayette ships La Victoire landed near Georgetown in South Carolina on the 13th of June, 1777. The young Marquis had financed his trips with his own money against the will of his father-in-law, the Duke Jean de Noailles, and even against the will of King Louis XVI. Yet Benjamin Franklin had written to the Continental Congress urging them to welcome the young Marquis. No doubt that the fact that Lafayette was wealthy, a nobleman of course, and a Freemason helped his cause once he arrived in Philadelphia. Soon after Lafayette's arrival, the Franco-American Treaty of Alliance was signed in Paris in February of 1778. The treaty was formalizing the French recognition and support of US independence. It was decisive, of course, in the defeat of the British Army. And soon after this treaty, French officers started to arrive in the US. In May of 1780, about 5,000 soldiers, 460 officers and their servants arrived, or left, should I say, the port of Brest in Brittany, and they landed in Rhode Island in July. Alors, the secret code name of the operation was l'Expédition Particulière. French soldiers set camp in Newport, an impoverished town at the time of 9,000 inhabitants. Well, the arrival of the French troop almost doubled the population. As soon as another 7,000 naval officer or personnel arrived, the town grew even bigger. But today, no need to give you a glorious account of Lafayette in America. Instead, I'd like to speak to you about a matter that may sound pedestrian, but which is in fact capital: the task of feeding French troops in America. So when the French troops landed in America, they were tired after 3 months at sea. The boats were crowded, the soldiers had quarters which smelled terrible. Dysentery and scurvy were common on ships. Once they landed, a period of rest was necessary. The men had to regain some strength. 10% of them were treated in hospital as soon as they arrived. Fortunately, French soldiers were very motivated and were eager to defeat the British enemies. Organizing the food supply chain for French soldiers was essential. American officials feared that the French would be extorted by unscrupulous individuals, setting prices of merchandise way over what was reasonable. Upon arrival, the French army had brought 2 months of supply, so it was urgent to act. The New England states were eager to get a share of the economic boon. At the request of Lafayette, Jeremiah Wadsworth, former Commissary General of the Continental Army, was appointed to the task of Commissaire Général for the French forces. He had therefore the responsibility of negotiating prices with food providers. Supplying the French forces was a science and was a reflection of the professionalism of the King's forces. American observers realized it very quickly. Washington entourage agreed, quote, "Compared to haphazard American organization, the regulations regarding the affair of the French army are most perfect. The officers and soldiers are extremely civil and the best-looking men we've ever saw." There was a clear culture clash in between the French army, accustomed to its own centralized method of doing business and filled with rule and regulations, and the more casual, organic American ways. Our experience in Europe had shown that French soldiers could revolt after only 2 days without their food allowance. So unlike their American counterpart, French troops would not put up with dismal food supply or even without pay. Desertion was on the mind of Lafayette and of Rochambeau, of course. Indeed, many of the soldiers were poor, bachelor, and landless in France. the vast American land was for sure a big attraction. Additionally, about 20% of French troops were German-speaking, mostly soldiers from Alsace-Lorraine. The German-speaking land of Pennsylvania was therefore very hospitable to them. Not to mention that the landscape and the topography of the Northeast reminding many Alsatians and Lorrainians of their homeland. In fact, of the 316 deserters from the Rochambeau army, about 200 were German-speaking. This was considerable and represented about 19% of the Alsatian and Lorrainian troops in the French army. So for centuries, food supply of the French Royal Army had been at the center of preoccupation of French officers. When it came to supplying bread to troops, the French Corps Expéditionnaire came with some commissaires de guerre, war commissaries, in charge of logistics. Their role was primarily to follow the troops, to buy goods from farmers, and to channel it back. From there, each French battalion had several vivriers in charge of food allocation. The position entitled of commissaire de guerre, war commissary, was a key element in the French army. In fact, they acted as official magistrates in charge of budget, supervising the quality and the fair distribution of the goods. For instance, French war commissaries did not trust American bread suppliers. Past experience had shown that some American suppliers could be deceitful and unscrupulous. At times they would underbake the bread, making it harder to digest, giving soldiers a false sense of being full. Others would purposely use inferior grain and added more water in order to artificially increase the weight of the loaves. That would not do for the French troops. In essence, the French trusted only themselves when it came to bread and food in general. As it is often the case, money talks, and the money kept flowing from France. The king was sending a lot of silver and gold coins. Naturally, American farmers and suppliers loved doing business with French troops. This eventually created a big problem for their American counterparts. They did not have the resources of the French troops and were often reduced to begging, even worse, plundering villagers during their marches. This scenario was repeating itself wherever French troops were arriving. The French army had its own agents riding ahead of the troops. They were buying all the flowers, cows, sheep that they could, and often they were leaving the American soldiers desperate. French leadership understood that feeding its troops was at the heart of all things. Le pain de munition, or ammunition bread in English, was the French basic food for the soldiers. In old military French, munition was synonymous of provision, provision, hence the term pain de munition, bread of provision. French officers had to balance four main requirements: keeping the cost of bread as low as possible, avoiding waste, preserving the highest nutritional quality of bread, and of course, the bread should taste good. French were at the avant-garde in this regard, and no other nation had ever given so much thought to the matter of feeding troops. Now, during long encampment period, most of the flours had to be brought on slow-moving ox carts. Finding transportation was one of the biggest challenge of military encampment. Horses were faster, of course, but a 1,500-pound cart of wheat or rye, pulled by 6 oxen, would require 12 horses. As we can imagine, French soldiers were relying on bread far more than their American counterparts. So when shortage of flour took place, the larger portion was going to the French troops, while American had to be satisfied with dry beans. The production of bread had been on the mind of French officers since the 16th century and the days of King Henry III of France. And by the Age of Enlightenment, the top brass recruited some scientists. They were advisors to the military staff. In fact, since the early Middle Ages, food and health were intermingled in the mind of French elite. Simply put, for French army commanders, bread was an essential part of military medicine. Military leadership knew full well that the fighter suffered twice as often from diseases connected to a poor diet than from injuries on the battlefield. This is why bread supplies for marching armies had been the subject of numerous French scholarly books. The French had great manuals and technical knowledge. Troops knew how to build temporary oven, to bake their own bread on the field if necessary. Soldiers were taught how to build an oven by simple excavation in the ground. It took 4 hours to build such an oven and 2 hours to bake the bread. This was perfect when troops were encamping several days in the same spot. If encamping for several weeks, French were building huge bread oven, 6 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, built mostly underground and made of cobblestone. The strictly regulated layout of mess kitchen was brought to an art in French military manuals. The perfect mechanical manners of the French in digging a circular hole, in making niches in which to set their camp kettles for cooking, was an amazement to many American officers. Food for the French army was never an afterthought. King Louis XVI had commissioned scientists as he was concerned by the nutritional value of bread given to his men. Since the Royal Ordinance of 1776, the quantity of seigle, rye, in a loaf was limited to half, the other half being blé, that is, wheat. Yes, rye was cheaper than wheat, but it had poor nutritional value and was harder to digest than wheat. In fact, French soldiers preferred wheat because they appreciated its taste. Bread preservation was also at the center of attention. French army bakers knew that a loaf could easily mold by excess of moisture or because of the poor quality of the grain or flour. Waste was simply not an option. Under the recommendation of a commission headed by Parmentier, to diminish the risk of molding, the wheat flour had to be sieved. So in order to reduce the quantity of bran, that is the fibrous outer shell of the wheat, French engineers designed the best portable sieves of any country, and these were very useful to the troops. Yet not all French officers were unanimous. Carrying sieves could create problems when battalions were in constant movement. It added to the cost and volume of material that troops had to transport with them. Yet King Louis decided that the pain de munition, ammunition bread, should be as designed by the commission headed by Parmentier. It must contain more white flour and less bran. To promote preservation, French scientists had demonstrated that kneading the bread twice as long as it is normally required would increase its longevity threefold. Yet, there were some problems. On a battlefield, it was not easy to ask the boulanger to do such intense work. Being a baker was more often the job of a veteran rather than a man in his prime youth. So extra kneading would require young and strong boulangers, and men were in short supply. In reality, such constraint often proved too much. What was possible as a scientific exercise could not always be applied to the battlefield, where speed and times were paramount. It is important to understand that under the king's rule, money was withheld from each soldier's salary. Bread was not free. It is only after the French Revolution that the supply of food was one of the benefits of soldiers and was not deducted from their salaries. During the American War of Independence, the value of a daily food ration was about 3 sols. The sol was the French currency of the day. This was quite considerable, since soldiers were paid about 6 to 9 sols per day. This being said, French soldiers could not buy much with their money anyway. A pound of bread sold on the Newport market costed as much as 3 days of wages. So in comparison, army bread was charged at a huge discount. A pound of potatoes sold on a farmer market could cost up to 6 sols, as did a gallon of rum, both costing a French soldiers a daily wage. Under French rules, an ammunition bread was to last 2 days and weigh 1.5 kilos. That is about 3.4 pounds. That meant that the daily ration was more than 1.5 pounds of bread for a French soldier. As a response to the bread supply problem, French troops on American ground had to resort sometimes to biscuits de campagne, known, I believe, in the US as hardtack. They were already common on French ships, where baking bread was not really an option. These biscuits de campagne had several advantages. They were very compact and light to carry. They were rich in calories. They were less susceptible to mold because very poor in bran and in water content. They had a longevity of many months actually. They require far less labor than making your own bread daily, and they were cheap, which was very important in times of war. French soldiers used to dunk them in alcohol or in warm broth, and by doing so the hardtack would swell and soften. However, the biscuits de campagne were not a favorite of French soldiers. They were made without yeast and salt, they were dry and hard, and not too healthy. A lack of fiber was created cases of constipation. Trivial, as it may sound, it would slow down troops. The lack of fibers was, as I said, creating a lot of problems, and we always forget to speak about it. So they were a temporary solution, those hardtack, in case of necessity, but were not sustainable in the long run. I should also mention the fire cake, a tasteless mixture of flour and water cooked over open fire, known to the Continental Army in time of deprivation. So we spoke about bread, but during the War of Independence, French soldiers were to be provided with other type of food, of course. Meat. The allowance for meat was about a pound per day, half a pound of beef and half a pound of pork. It cost the soldiers about a sol per day out of the 6 to 9 sol. There was no practical means of food preservation. The meat was often salted or smoked, sometimes even dried. In keeping with the Catholic religion, on Friday salt fish was also provided when possible, in place of meat. French soldiers were known for being great hunters. They were gathering game and foraging all along the way, and this was vital to their diet. In addition to deers and rabbit, French soldiers were catching crows, geese, pheasant, beaver, squirrel, turtles. Cattle and sheep were slaughtered as needed near camps, usually enjoyed fresh rather than salted. When possible, the animals in herds were following the troops from camp to camp. They were either grazing or eating some hay. However, pork meat was usually brought to the encampment in barrels of about 100 kilos, 220 pounds, and the meat was salted, of course. French soldiers loved the lard, the bacon. They were getting about 60 grams of it per day, 2 ounces roughly. They mostly used it for cooking. Some American officers noted that during a long encampment, the amount of beef, pork and mutton consumed by the French army was enormous. Whenever available, an average French soldier was eating 2 pounds of meat a day, twice the ration of the American. So for groups of 200 men, 400 pounds of meat a day was necessary. An ox, when slaughtered, would provide about 400 pounds of meat. A sheep would provide 100 pounds of meat, so 4 sheep per day were needed to feed 200 men. The French army had come with their own butchers, of course. They were more skilled in the art of cutting meat than their American counterpart. The meat was always more tender due to the cutting techniques they employed. When French soldiers were marching, supplying meat was more challenging, of course. It often dropped to a pound per day, sometimes less, which was more in line, as I said, with American standards. Butter was also part of the provision, about 200 grams, 7 ounces per week. It was considered as a delicacy when available. French soldiers liked to eat it raw, on a slice of bread. It was rarely used for cooking. Let's speak about drinks now. Half a liter of milk, roughly a pint, was also part of the diet. A liter of beer or hard cider, about a quart, was given to French fighters since wine was not available. In Europe, of course, French soldiers would drink wine. 100 milliliters of whiskey or rum, about 3.3 ounces, was provided if beer or cider were not available. French soldiers did not drink tea or coffee and were surprised to see their American counterparts consuming a large quantity of these beverages. Marches were exhausting, of course. Therefore, soldiers had to carry as little as possible. The only water they got was usually provided by brooks and streams. French scientists had shown that vinegar was used to, how could I say it, as an antiseptic, to clean the water from creeks, rivers, and lakes, and it had proven to be very, very efficient. Additionally, vinegar was also adding flavor to food. At the time, vinegar was wrongly believed to cure scurvy by the French. As we know, it didn't. You had to cure it with vitamin C. Let's speak about beans. French troops were getting about 100 grams of beans or peas per day, 3.5 ounces. They would boil them in water and add the meat to make a stew. If lucky, onion, turnips or potatoes might appear on the menu, but that was quite rare, as we can imagine. Corn was a novelty for French soldiers who had never eaten it before. They didn't really care for it. The French soldiers were mostly housed in tents, just like their American counterparts. There were usually 9 men per tent. American had smaller sized tents. There were about 6 men per tent. Each tent created a unit called a mess, and each unit was sharing food. So for the French soldiers, daily rations were distributed for 9 people. Soldiers were responsible for cooking their own food, as cooks were only available to officers. Soldiers were eating in a gamelle, that is a little mess tin, and they were using a knife, a spoon, and their fingers, of course, to eat. But they were at a disadvantage. Contrary to Americans, there were no women, French women, following them in the Continental Army. We knew that in the Continental Army, a wife could follow her husband and served as a cook for the tent. Additionally, when possible, American families were sending food to their son engaged in the field. That was not possible. That was not the case for French people. Fortunately, French troops were generally supported by locals. Donations were frequent. Farmers were also setting market along the way, but only French officers had the means to acquire food from the markets. Daily life was different for many superior officers. In theory, superior French officers were required to sleep in the camp with the men, but many documents show that superior officers often lodged in nearby houses or taverns, where food, Madeira, and port was quite abundant. This was particularly true for high-ranking noblemen. But the gentry or petite noblesse did not share in that privilege. When superior officers stayed in the camp, their tents were very spacious, with camp bed, chairs, table, candles, plateware and silverware. They also had their own servant and cooks. During marches, troops were often awakened at 2 a.m. and would march usually until 5 in the morning. This was to avoid the heat during the warm months. At 5, soldiers were taking a break and eating a bit of their daily allowance, some food that they had cooked themselves the night before. The march would resume until noon. Then there was an hour break for lunch. The march started again until about 5, and men were eating the rest of the ration. Sometimes French officers were puzzled about Americans. What a strange people who troubled themselves very little with provisions. Often during marches, American men were given a bit of corn or dry beans and seems to be content with it. That would not do for the French. So in conclusion, feeding their men was at the heart of preoccupation of French officers. All historians agree the British failure to provide adequate food supplies to its troops was one of the causes of its defeat. To make an analogy, you may have a better tank than your enemy, but if you do not have the fuel, you can't use it. Food was French fuel and medicine. It kept a sound body and gave French fighters a good spirit. Of all the weapons cherished by the French army, none could surpass bread. Let's not forget that the final victory of the American and of the French allies was born of stomach well fed whenever possible. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.